On your right is the 75-inch TCL C93, on your left is the 65-inch Samsung QN95B, and to benchmark these two mini LED TVs, there's a Sony BVM HX310 dual-layer LCD mastering monitor on the floor as reference. In this dark campfire scene from the 4K Blu-ray of The Revenant, the TCL C93 not only manifested less blooming around the white subtitles than the Samsung QN95B, but also came closer to matching the HDR presentation on the Sony BVM HX310, since the Samsung QN95B suffered from undefeatable dynamic tone mapping which brightened the picture excessively beyond reference. And the superior blooming suppression on the TCL C93 was certainly helped by its higher number of local dimming zones, coming in at 1,920 zones from a 64x30 grid. Once dynamic tone mapping and other superfluous settings were switched off, the TCL C93 also delivered accurate PQ UTF tracking in movie mode, reproducing the creative intent in a more faithful manner than the QN95B, which indulged in visible over-brightening of the HDR10 picture due to its always-on dynamic tone mapping, frequently leading to a paradoxical drop in perceived contrast, with reduced black depth in most dark scenes. However, the respective advantages were reversed in SDR mode, where the Samsung QN95B provided a closer match to the Sony BVM HX310 reference monitor across different APLs or average picture levels. With local dimming set to high, SDR gamma tracking on the TCL C93 would vary with different APLs, resulting in a boosted and inaccurate SDR presentation. And switching local dimming to the low setting was not a viable solution at all, owing to the drastic loss of contrast with raised blacks, so we had no choice but to go with local dimming high. However, the local dimming algorithm on the TCL C93 seemed to be adding a brighter line of illumination just beneath the top letterbox bar, which we first noticed on test pattern windows during calibration. The brighter line would manifest in CinemaScope movies, particularly if the top portion of the screen was fairly uniform without much texture to mask it. Dropping local dimming to low would lessen the effect, but as demonstrated earlier, it's a no-go due to the elevated blacks and reduced contrast, so we certainly hope TCL engineers can fine-tune its local dimming algorithm to eradicate this top-line brightening in CinemaScope content, especially considering that the step-down 65-inch C83 mini LED television did not suffer from this issue when tested a few months ago, although there's a possibility that different screen sizes may be responsible too. On the whole, the local dimming on the TCL C93 was pretty stable, with a tendency to crush some shadow detail in very low APL scenes to suppress blooming, although we spotted some backlight fluctuations from time to time, for example during fade-in from black to a star field. Otherwise, just like on the TCL C83, because engaging dynamic tone mapping on the C93 would over-brighten the HDR presentation beyond reference levels, we very much preferred to keep dynamic tone mapping disabled in the interest of picture accuracy. One aspect where the TCL C93 undoubtedly had the upper hand over the Samsung QN95B was in the handling of dark HLG content. Like most if not all Samsung TVs, the QN95B would manifest a visible blue, purplish tint when displaying dark sequences in House of the Dragons from the new Sky Stream box in HLG HDR, whereas the TCL exhibited no such issues. Let's talk some hard numbers. Our 75-inch TCL C93 review sample could reach 2000 nits of measured peak brightness, though only on a 5% window after calibration to D65 white point. On a standard 10% window, peak brightness dropped to around 1300 nits, which is of course not to be sneezed at, but nowhere near 2000 nits. Nevertheless, when displaying real-world HDR content containing bright elements, the TCL C93 comfortably exceeded 1000 nits, and combined with a full field brightness of more than 600 nits, this allowed for an impactful HDR presentation that's beyond the reach of even the brightest 2022 OLED TV when it came to very high APL scenes. Motion performance and video processing were similar to the TCL C83 we reviewed a few months ago. generally not quite reaching the standards set by A brands, mainly because of the use of a MediaTek HDMI 2.1 chipset without coprocessor, as evidenced by coarser native 10-bit gradation near black. Upscaling veered on the soft side with some fizziness, which can be unforgiving on bit-starved content, and engaging motion interpolation would induce noticeable frame skipping in a handful of 25 frames per second content, prompting us to disable motion clarity when watching 25p movies. Otherwise, we had no issues with 24 frames per second films or 50Hz broadcast content on the TCL C93. Even engaging motion clarity did not introduce any microstutter or frame drops in challenging 50Hz broadcast material with mixed edits. Screen uniformity on our TCL 75 C93 review sample was overall cleaner than on the 65-inch C83 we previously tested, manifesting less dirty screen effect or DSE on full-field gray slides, though once we got to near white, some yellow tinting was visible in the center of the screen, which was reflected in the measurement charts too. In terms of LCD panel, the 75-inch TCL C93 uses a VA-type panel with some of the deepest native black levels among LED LCDs, with local dimming turned off, and peak white aligned to a darkroom target of 120 candelas per square meter. Black level measured 0.02 nits on a 4x4 ANSI checkerboard pattern, giving us a native contrast ratio of almost 6,000 to 1. While this figure was slightly lower than what we measured on the 65-inch C83, which could be caused by panel-to-panel variation, the significantly higher number of local dimming zones on the flagship TCL C93 more than made up for it, delivering deeper blacks with less blooming artifacts, although both mini-LED televisions exhibited occasional backlight fluctuations at the exact same points during scene changes. VA LCD normally suffers from slower pixel response times than IPS-type LCD, let alone OLED, so it is hardly surprising to see some trailing artifacts behind a fast-moving ball when watching footy on the TCL C93. Viewing angles held up well and weren't as narrow as what's found on most VA LCD panels, and TCL's wise decision to avoid using a viewing angle compensation filter not only preserved deep blacks, but also meant that the effective anti-glare coating on the C93 did not manifest rainbow reflections when hit by light at certain angles. Next, gaming. But before I talk about input lag and 4K 120Hz resolution, I would like to thank Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. Since the pandemic started, some streaming providers, including Netflix, have throttled the bitrate of certain shows, especially in Europe, resulting in a softer picture with more compression artifacts. This is where a VPN comes in. Surfshark allows you to stream content from another country without needing you to be physically there, so you can watch Netflix at higher bit rates with better picture quality. You can also get more content that's not available in your region, perhaps the US Netflix library, which contains more movie titles. For less than the price of a Big Mac per month, you can use Surfshark on as many devices as you want in your household, all at the same time. There's 24/7 live customer support, a 30-day money-back guarantee, and if you use promo code HDTV test, you will get 85% off, as well as 3 extra months free until the end of the year. So sign up today and give Surfshark a try. I'll put a link in the YouTube description below. Thanks again for your support. Okay, for gaming, input lag measured 14 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, even with local dimming set to high, and 5 milliseconds at 120 frames per second, ensuring that you can enjoy supremely low latency and high contrast performance at the same time. The TCL C93 resolved full 4K 120Hz resolution in HDR and VRR mode, although some mild distortions were visible on this HDR10 pattern from the Ryan Masiola test disk, indicating compromised bandwidth from the underlying MediaTek HDMI 2.1 chipset without the help of a coprocessor. This is further confirmed by the fact that the TCL C93 managed to resolve full 444 chroma at 4K 60Hz in SDR, but not at 4K 120Hz in HDR despite engaging PC mode, which is essential for 444 chroma reproduction. Local dimming also seemed to be permanently disabled in PC mode, resulting in shallower blacks and reduced contrast. So on balance, Game Mode is our preferred picture preset for playing games even from a PC, with HDR and VRR including NVIDIA G-Sync working well to eliminate tearing and frame drops, though some mild VRR flicker was inevitable in certain games, especially during more sedate scenes and on static menus. By default, the PQ-UTF in HDR Game Mode tracked significantly brighter than reference with HDRG engaged, causing max TML and max FFTML to clip far earlier than necessary at 850 nits according to the HDRG calibration screen on the Xbox Series X. Disabling HDRG on the TCL-C93 would increase the max TML and max FFTML clipping points to 1050 nits, but in reality, this was more the result of dynamic tone mapping being activated whenever the HDRG setting was switched off. While the HDR10 PQ-UTF tracking measured OK on a 10% window with HDRG disabled, the dynamic tone mapping would still over-brighten and wash out the HDR presentation, requiring us to increase the gamma value as a compromise to improve image depth. Because of the onboard MediaTek MT5889 SoC, only 2 out of 4 HDMI ports are HDMI 2.1, each supporting the full HDMI 2.1 bandwidth of 48 gigabits per second. Crucially though, TCL has managed to migrate eARC functionality to one of the 2 4K 60Hz HDMI 2.0 ports, therefore giving the C93 an advantage over other TVs using the MediaTek HDMI 2.1 chipset by truly freeing up the 2 HDMI 2.1 ports for those of you intending to use eARC. Bolstered by its integrated Onkyo 2.1.2 sound system, the TCL C93 was one of the better sounding TVs we've heard this year, delivering impressive bass and power which is more than sufficient for casual viewing. Note that just like on the C83, the mute icon will never disappear upon muting the volume, so you would have to increase volume to 1 to make the icon go away on the TV. Let's sum up. Blessed with the highest number of local dimming zones on a 2022 4K mini LED television, the 75-inch TCL C93 delivered deeper blacks, less blooming, and higher perceived contrast than any other non-OLED TVs including the step-down C83 we've tested this year, providing a closer match to the Sony BVM HX310 reference monitor in dark HDR scenes. However, the only usable local dimming high setting on the C93 would introduce a thin, brighter stripe along the top of CinemaScope movies, and while screen uniformity on our review unit was better than on the C83, there's some yellow tinting in the middle on full field white. Motion handling, video processing, and software UI were also not as refined as those implemented on A brands. But considering that the 75-inch model is at least £1,000 cheaper than the Samsung QN95B and the Sony X95K of equivalent screen size, the TCL C93 earns our recommended Best Value award. Now, as deep as the blacks were on the C93, they still won't be able to match the blacks and shadow detail accuracy on OLED TVs which feature pixel-level illumination control. However, some of you may still prefer to buy an LED LCD over an OLED TV, especially in light of several issues which are unique to OLED, which I've covered in this video you can watch by clicking here.